Now, we know that a week is a long time in politics, but a year, it can go like that. This time last year, the final comments on the first year of the Prime Ministership of Anthony Albanese was that he was heading high into the holidays. 12 months later, same poll, same people. Most voters now disapprove of Anthony Albanese's performance as the Prime Minister. Now, reality is things have been shaky for a while. We've been talking about the series of failed promises, the problems when it comes to cost of living, the outright lies, the promise one thing, do another thing, pay attention to what they do, not what they say. But we all know when the wheels started to fall off. It's when the Prime Minister decided that the voice must continue on. Now, it's 6, 7 weeks since Australia turned around and said hell no, but for months before that, we all know what was going to happen. 60-40, yes, turned into 60-40 no. Prime Minister had an opportunity to change a question, never did, because his expectation was that this was, apart from something he believed in, it was going to be a wedge for the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party would find itself with just a third of its flank being on the no campaign, well, it ended up being where the majority of Australians, of course, ended up being. And the Prime Minister has never really found his mojo since. In the weeks after, he's struggled to come up with what the agenda was, because the assumption was, as we said to you the whole way through, part of the way that the voice was prosecuted was that it was meant to be sort of the aerial support to hide from all of the things that the government was getting wrong. But they'd be able to point to this as the giant achievement of 2023, before, like all first-term governments, going into an early election in 2024. But the reality is there's most likely not to be an election next year, but a year is a long time in politics. If they feel there's advantage in one, they'll take one. But unlike the scenario that the Liberals had when they had 90 seats and a backbench to burn, they, of course, didn't burn it for a great idea like economic reform, say, like John Howard burnt his first-term backbench of more than 90 MPs. Remember, you only need 76 to actually be the government in majority. Instead, no, it was burnt because the Liberal Party did exactly what the Labor Party did, and that was to make somebody the Prime Minister who you didn't choose. Malcolm Turnbull's political genius meant that he burnt all of the political advantage that had been put in place after the 2013 election. The 2010 election ended up being a dead heat and a minority government because, again, the Labor Party had ruined all of its political capital that it got when it got, again, 90 seats, the same margin, at the end of John Howard's time in 2007. But Albo does not even have 80 members in the parliament, let alone 90. So he is in a scenario where if the natural gravity that goes between elections, where you lose a couple here and a couple there, he is staring down the barrel of most likely spending 2024 not trying to convince us that he should be re-elected, but trying to hold on to a majority. You see the existence of the Teals, the Greens, a media that's desperate to back in the Prime Minister means it is always very difficult for any government to be a one-term government. Now, I'm sceptical about whether this is a government that is a one-term government. I think more likely it is to be a minority government, and quite a sizably and quite a significantly government in minority. In fact, if the news poll that showed us 50-50 between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party is correct, the Liberal Party, well, it moves into the low 60s, still way too far away from being able to form power. But the Labor Party, well, it falls into the early 70s, which means it needs the Greens or the Teals or some of the other independents, but it won't be able to get there on its own. So as we know, the assumption is of this government that they are able to hold on to power, or at least hold on to a chance of having a very slim minority parliament that they have to deal with in the next term, where, of course, as Julia Gillard can tell them, you get pushed into doing plenty of things you don't want to do. We know that the Prime Minister, immediately following the voice, decided to leak the information to the newspapers that he was starting up a new campaign. And it was a specific campaign about making Peter Dutton unelectable to the Australian people. The suggestion was that they could make as much scare or fire up as much dirt as possible. You know, all the dirt that the lefty media hasn't already found, all the dirt that the Ghost hasn't been able to deploy to this point as he works his way down the list of MPs who voted against him in 2018. Now, the reality is that, as I told you on this night, straight after the voice, the best part of, 6, 7 weeks ago, that the whole plan would be get Dutton. And it has been just that. The entire focus of the Labor Party has been trying to put the focus on the opposition, But this is now backfiring, and you will be quite surprised who is noticing it. As you know, get Dutton is the only strategy they have.
That says everything about your incapacity to take responsibility for anything. It was supposed to be nice,
Leader
Peter,
of the Nationals,
but he can't survive to 2:05. There is no issue too big for him to show how small he is. What we have seen from this bloke here is consistent with his entire political career has been based upon division. You struggle to find the chamber, mate. It's got to be happier, Mr. Speaker.
the Prime Minister will return to the question.
Smile a bit more. Remember when he ran for the leadership and he was going to smile some more.
Now, the reality is that this is all inside baseball, but it is all about the message that's being sent to the troops, who then have to go out and argue the case of an underperforming government in the media. Now, Labor is, if nothing else, very loyal to its message. Remember the absurdity when we had, because Julia Gillard said no to same-sex marriage, Penny Wong had to pretend that she was against same-sex marriage. But of course, when all of that was brought about via the plebiscite that Peter Dutton helped make happen, she, of course, was front and centre as one of the MPs most excited for the change. You see, in Labor, if they tell you to march this way, that way, you do, regardless of whether or not you think they should be marching in that direction or completely the opposite one. Message discipline. That's why they don't cross the floor. If they do cross the floor, they get expelled. If nothing else, that's good for getting your message across, but when the message is the bad message, well, nobody is pushing back in the other direction. And believe it or not, even the people over at the Channel 9 newspapers are noticing that Get Dutton is not as successful as they thought it was. You see, it's exactly the same trick that was put up against Tony Abbott, but it didn't work. The assumption that, oh, well, if we make him sort of as scary as possible and say words like extreme over and over again, eventually it'll catch on. As I've said many times before, and I say this because it's just the way it is, this is because they're trying to replicate what Joe Biden has to this point been quite successful at doing, which is to cover up all of his failures by pointing at his political opponent. Well, I repeat, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, today, Albanese's strategy of targeting Dutton is backfiring, and not just a little, badly, which is why the alternative Prime Minister ends the year in a much better position than he was 12 months ago. Now, again, there is no poll right now saying that he is the preferred Prime Minister, but his side is now at 50-50. The likelihood of the government being able to fight its way out of the paper bag it's put itself into, we'll all have to wait and see together. But with 50% of the country saying that Aussies feel financially worse off under Labor, it doesn't matter what the spin doctors or the policy advisors or the media mates do. The reality is that more than half of the country is financially worse off than before this government came to power. Something that polling groups have been noticing, including, as we showed you last week, this conversation with the group who is a largely lefty-leaning polling group, in a conversation with our mate Laura Jays last Monday. There'll be another one tomorrow.
The problem is that they're not ticking the competency box, and it's this lack of action that they're seeing. So people are becoming quite disenchanted, quite frustrated. It's now becoming sort of an entrenched characteristic of the Prime Minister that maybe he doesn't have what it's needed, what's required to lead us through this really complex economic environment. People recognise it's complex economic environment. So, sort of in the same way, leading into 2022 election, we talked about how that sort of lack of empathy, the other side of the equation on Morrison had become entrenched as a characteristic of his. This competency thing is really at risk now of becoming an entrenched characteristic of Anthony Albanese and this government. If they don't come out the other side of Christmas swinging pretty hard on the economy, on cost of living, on job security, that's starting to worry people now as this economic crisis sort of bites, on housing, then I think, if by mid next year we're still having this conversation, I think it's all over.
Fascinating stuff to watch. Now, again, he doesn't want to say that. He is somebody who, in part, that company's been giving advice to the Teals. But he's saying that they are running out of road. So the fire alarm that is going off inside those who want this government to stick around is going off right now. And the reality is that with every year and more technology and more media and more commentary, the capacity of the Australian people to move on is pretty quick. And the bloke who was the solution to all the problems a couple of years ago becomes the problem a couple of years later. As you will have heard today, the same organisation sat around and gave an insight to James Campbell in the Telegraph, the Herald Sun and the Courier Mail into exactly what people's position was when it comes to this Prime Minister. In fact, some of the people who have given the advice to Redbridge that you saw just then says, among other things, and this was done in the seats of Griffith and Ryan, done in Stewart and Boothby, so we're talking about Liberal, Labor and even Green seats, quote, he hasn't really addressed cost of living. I get that there's global factors at play, but I don't think he's done much to concentrate action, much concrete action on it. Well, that would be, again, what we've talked about for months, things like the being able to cut petrol prices. Now, does it fix everything? No. Does it show the government gets it? Yes. Another said, he doesn't come across as strong. He comes across like he wants to be liked, but without making strong. The most devastating verdict came from a Queensland voter who said he's not a leader, he's a follower, he's a beta male. Now, I would suggest anyone using terms like beta male as opposed to alpha male, being a strong male, probably wasn't in the pocket of the Prime Minister, but still it's somebody in a name that, as Corey Bernardi said, is probably going to catch on, just like Airbus Albo, despite the fact they're trying to gaslight us that, oh no, well, compared to the past 6 different Prime Ministers, oh hang on, don't count that one, and don't count that one, and only half count that one, he's so much better than everyone. But here's the bit that matters. The consistent complaint across the groups was that the federal government has not done enough to tackle cost of living. I just don't see the action on cost of living pressures. He's missing an action, and now he's running off overseas again, one voter said. While another complained that the belt is getting tighter, but there is no action. Now, the great hand-wringing amongst many people in the professional press is, well, kind of part of what they do for a living. But then there are those that have not been the sharpest critics of Anthony Albanese, unlike myself, from, yes, even before day one, was it minus 1,000, minus 500, minus 25 days to go? Paul Kelly, writing in the Australian newspaper over the weekend, well, he says middle-class financial woes build into an electoral tidal wave. That's the reality. Well, the Prime Minister has turned around and said, oh, we've done something for the people at the very bottom of things, but even then, it's only if kids are in childcare. Majority of people don't have kids in childcare. Oh, it's for cheaper medicines. OK, but the vast majority of people don't get affected by that because, of course, they're not pensioners. Meantime, Peter Harcher, writing again in the Sydney Morning Herald, says about some internal conversations that are happening inside the Labor Party. And we all know he'd be more clued into that now that the ghost is no longer around to tell him what's happening inside the Liberal Party or Julie Bishop. Voters aren't hearing us. The tough advice from the Prime Minister's inner circle. But the reality is that this Prime Minister, like all Prime Ministers who win an election, think that they have some sort of magic connection to the Australian people. I got it oh so right once, so I will get it oh so right next time. But the reality is, as 2019's special connection with the Australian people became a problem in 2022, exactly the same as the 2022 election may well be the case for the 2024-2025 election. Elections are just but a moment in time. And people are very harsh judges on people who promise to fix something and then don't actually fix it. Now, they'll turn around and say they have a fix for it, but they don't fix it. It's a little bit like when you go to the mechanic and they swear they've done something about that noise that you keep hearing in the engine, but the noise is still there in the engine. The people who say, oh, we absolutely fixed the sunroof, but the sunroof still doesn't always open or close. And the experience for most Australians is that things are not better. In fact, they are demonstrably worse.